The original Prince of Persia was created by Jordan Mechner on his Apple II computer in between classes at Yale. His father did the music, and Mechner recorded his brother performing the prince's movements that he would later rotoscope and transform into the smoothest gaming animation of the 80s. Players controlled the prince, who must make his way out of the evil Jafar's dungeon and ascend 12 levels to the tower, facing off with combative swordsmen and avoiding death traps along the way. At the top of the tower is the princess, who will be forced to marry Jafar in 1 hour. And you only have 1 hour of real time to reach the princess, or it will result in a game over. To make things worse, the prince doesn't move like Mario. There's a real weight to the character. He moves with momentum, which requires the player to carefully consider each move, or else suffer the consequences. Prince of Persia captivated players with its mix of puzzles, death-defying platforming, and tense cinematic combat sequences. The game was a major influence in the action-adventure genre, and was ported to nearly every gaming platform in the early 1990s, where it would go on to sell over 2 million copies and launch a franchise.
And so the young lovers were wed and they lived happily, well, for 11 days.
The follow-up to Prince of Persia was called The Shadow and the Flame. It had improved graphics, with larger areas to explore, and more variety in its backdrops and colors. Though I should at least mention that the SNES port of the original was also pretty nice looking. The gameplay in The Shadow and the Flame is similar to the original Prince of Persia, with death traps, puzzles, and exciting platforming. But this time around, there is much more of an emphasis on combat and action. Fights in the original were always tense one-on-one duels, but now the prince may find himself surrounded by 3 to 4 enemies at once. It didn't sell as well as the original, but Prince of Persia 2 was still a commercial success, and for the next century, the prince would be exploring completely new territory. For the first time in the series, Prince of Persia took the leap into 3D, complete with voice acting.
Excuse me, Sultan. The princess was expecting me.
Players can now jump across gaps, shimmy ledges, and even swim through water, all in a 3D environment. Unfortunately, due to problems behind the scenes, the game was forced to release early, and as a result, the game went out to the masses with a lot of bugs. It was also criticized for its unreliable camera and sluggish controls. On top of that, another game had recently left a big impression on a new generation of gamers, one that was actually inspired by the life or death platforming of the original Prince of Persia. Prince of Persia 3D was not a financial success and is considered a low point for the series. With lack of interest growing, it would take another 4 years before we would see the prince again. After the lackluster performance of Prince of Persia 3D, series creator Jordan Mechner distanced himself from the video game industry, something he had slowly been doing since the release of the original back in 1989. He had directed Prince of Persia 2, but remotely, sending the team a super detailed 200-plus page Bible to guide them in the making of the game. And on 3D, he was even further removed. He still contributed to the game's story and gave his overall blessing, but beyond that, he was basically hands-off. So it's no surprise that he would be reluctant when Ubisoft first approached him about doing a reboot. Considering the success of Tomb Raider and the underwhelming performance of Prince of Persia 3D, Mechner knew it would take more than nostalgia to be successful.
Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong. Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I am and why I say this. Sit down, and I will tell you a tale like none that you have ever heard.
Mechner flew out to Montreal to assist the young French-Canadian team at Ubisoft. He was impressed when he saw the prince moving so fluidly in 3D, now effortlessly running along walls, in addition to his usual acrobatic stunts. One of the early decisions made by Ubisoft Montreal team was to refer to the 1989 original for reference when designing the gameplay. But what intrigued Mechner from the very start were the time manipulation mechanics. These time powers allowed players to rewind time, which meant you got a do-over for that tough platforming section you were stuck on. Or players could even use these time powers to freeze time and gain a massive advantage during combat. Mechner saw how hungry this young team at Ubisoft Montreal was to revive the Prince of Persia series and to prove themselves within the industry. He joined the team at first as a creative consultant, but would eventually pen the script for Ubisoft's new take on the series. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time launched to critical acclaim in 2003 and sold over 2 million copies by the end of that same year. The young team at Ubisoft Montreal had made their mark and returned the Prince to prominence in the gaming world. With a big hit on their hands, Ubisoft wasted no time in starting the work on the sequel. This time they would be doing it without series creator Jordan Mechner, who had committed to a screenwriting job for the Sands of Time film adaptation. The team went bigger with the sequel, adding larger explorable environments that offered more freedom to the players. They took feedback from the fans of the first game and included more combat segments and boss fights for the sequel. Their feedback even helped shape the Prince's moveset. One of his new stunts, where he slides down the drapes using swords, was a suggestion taken directly from the Ubisoft forums. Combat in Warrior Within was also made to feel more free-flowing, with the Prince now acquiring secondary weapons on the fly. There were also new combo strings and time abilities that helped the combat reach new levels of depth. Warrior Within also featured some rather gory finishing moves, which cemented the game's overall dark and edgy tone with an M rating. The game was met with mostly favorable reviews, though some criticized the game's story and visual design, among other things.
It seems the Empress overestimated your abilities.
The Empress?
According to Ubisoft, Warrior Within sold 1.9 million units worldwide in just its debut month. A sequel was already in the works. The Two Thrones started production in 2004 at Ubisoft Casablanca, working in parallel with Ubisoft Montreal as they were finishing work on Warrior Within. Continuing the freeform style introduced in Warrior Within, the Prince can still pick up secondary weapons from defeated enemies or weapon racks. To help Two Thrones stand out from the previous games, speed kills were added as a new twist on the combat. In the previous titles, the stealth gameplay was pretty limited, but now, timing the button presses correctly meant the Prince would be able to use stealth to instantly defeat enemies. New on-rail segments were also added, where the Prince would have to fend off enemies as he took control of a wild chariot speeding down the streets. Another new mechanic was the Dark Prince. The Dark Prince didn't use a secondary weapon like the Prince normally would. Instead, he had a bladed whip called the Dagger Tail fused to his arm. The Dark Prince's health would decline constantly and needed to be refilled by defeating enemies or from select pickups. And predictably, this decision frustrated some players. Still, the game received mixed to positive reviews and sold 1.5 million units in just its first month. So, at this point, Ubisoft has put out a major Prince of Persia title each year for 3 years straight. But, for some reason, they felt it was time for a new direction for the series. Ubisoft went with a completely new look for the reboot, using a vibrant cel-shaded art style to complement the extravagant environments. In the reboot, players are tasked with cleansing a once beautiful city of its supernatural corruption. For the first time in the series, the reboot took a more open world approach to its gameplay, instead of the usual linear level designs. This meant that players could take on challenges in pretty much any order they chose, and the plot would play out accordingly. The new prince is joined by Elika, an AI character that would help the player in various ways. Most notably, she acted as the rewind feature, where she would save you automatically anytime you would have otherwise died. The combat and platforming had already been simplified in this new reboot, so having no consequences for mistakes may have been why gamers were left feeling like the game was a bit too easy overall. Still, the reboot reviewed fairly well and sold over 2 million copies in just its first month alone. It even received a much-needed DLC, which added an epilogue to the story. It was safe to call this a successful reboot of the series. And like before with Warrior Within and Two Thrones, Ubisoft had been working on a second Prince of Persia title during development of the reboot, but it wasn't a sequel to this game. The Forgotten Sands is a bit of a strange entry in the series. For starters, it takes place between the Sands of Time and Warrior Within, which means it totally disregards the new timeline set up in the 2008 reboot. This is because the game originally started as a tie-in with the Sands of Time movie that I mentioned earlier. The film was originally meant to release in 2008, but was delayed. The team wanted to use this as an opportunity to polish their game, but Ubisoft's publishing side wanted the game as soon as possible. And so the game's concept was reworked to fit the Sands of Time series. The really weird thing about Forgotten Sands is that there are 4 different versions of it, each made by a totally separate team. The main version of the game released on 360, PS3, and Windows. It returned to the linear structure from the previous games and ditched the open world style the reboot had. The combat was dumbed down and stripped of most mechanics introduced in the previous entries. Even so, the prince still had to fight more enemies than ever in Forgotten Sands, and critics were quick to call this out. Meanwhile, completely different games were made for the DS, PSP, and the Wii, each with their own distinctive visual designs, their own narratives, and their own gameplay mechanics, yet they all shared the same title. It's confusing, I know. They all had the usual things you'd expect from a Prince of Persia title though, the platforming, puzzles and traps, magical powers dealing with time manipulation, and some combat. In the end, all 4 games still managed to garner mixed to positive reviews. Still, it felt like a low point in the series, not felt since Arabian Nights, and it would take another 14 years before we would see the prince return. The Lost Crown is a new take on the Prince of Persia series, presented in a 2.5D side-scrolling style with a Metroidvania structure, meaning the game world is interconnected and filled with secrets, branching paths, and shortcuts. Players solve puzzles and fight enemies and bosses with acrobatic moves, counters, and of course, time manipulation. The Lost Crown introduces a new hero named Sargon, who is a warrior on a quest to rescue the kidnapped Prince Ghassan. The game was inspired by Persian mythology and introduces a lot of Persian folklore into the game's narrative and enemy design. The game was praised by critics for its fresh take on the Metroidvania formula, as well as its wide variety of accessibility and difficulty options. As far as reviving the series though, I guess time will tell.